For most of my life, since seeing the film at age 9, The Road Warrior has been my #1 favourite movie of all time. What struck me so powerfully on that first viewing as a kid was that the film made it very clear to me that there is a violent, brutal monster lurking within all of us, at both the collective and individual level. That monster lays dormant for most of us, most of the time, but it only takes the right combination of unfortunate circumstances for it to be unleashed and then seize overall control of our behaviour. The movie, in various ways, depicts this eternal struggle that haunts us throughout our lives, the never-ending psychological tug-of-war between our civilised side and our dark, destructive side. The very fact that we choose to watch action movies, which is a polite term for embracement of violence movies, that itself illustrates the point. If you'd asked me when I saw the film at age 9 to articulate these concepts, I wouldn't have been able to explain it in those terms, but I felt the message intensely, as if I'd been given a masterclass in dark psychology. And the film has stuck with me for life because of it. 41 years later, and though a few other films had briefly taken over as my favourite movie for a year or two at a time, movies like Blade Runner, The Thing, American Beauty, 2001, Road Warrior has been by far my most consistently favourite movie. I did make a 2-hour video analysis of the film about a decade ago, but for this shorter study I wanted to approach the film quite specifically from a Jungian archetype point of view. Especially, I want to explore how the film relates to Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. So, we'll be exploring how the film depicts the animal instinct side of human nature, the identification relationship between men and their vehicles, the duality between the good guys and bad guys, and we'll finish with an additional interpretation of Max himself, including the great psychological significance of him disappearing into the wasteland at the end of the movie. There's a very important Jungian interpretation of the ending that I want to give that I've not heard anywhere else. Before we get started on all this though, I'm first going to offer a few quotes from writer-director George Miller, which outlines that what I took from the film at age 9 was pretty much what he intended, but also points to the strong likelihood that Miller was influenced by Jungian psychological archetypes when conceiving Road Warrior. Interviewed by Danny Peary in 1984, Miller stated, quote, "The function of a storyteller should be to reveal truths about human nature through the depiction of people and their problems in a particular place and time. The reason we told these post-apocalyptic stories was to show some of the more primitive impulses that drive human beings. I think both films, Mad Max and Road Warrior, have value and that they help us explore the darker, more unthinkable aspects of ourselves." End quote. Referring to the first Mad Max film in the same interview, he stated, quote, "The film enjoyed success beyond the normal exploitation car films because we had unwittingly, unconsciously been servants of the collective consciousness. Mad Max was in fact another story about a lone outlaw who wandered through a dark wasteland. Similar stories have been told over and over again across all space and time, with the hero being a Japanese samurai or an American gunslinger or a wandering Viking, etc." End quote. Note that Miller used the term collective consciousness, which is a very specific psychological term. That term wasn't created by Carl Jung, but instead Jung is cited as coining the term collective unconscious. But this, along with other statements made by Miller about the meaning and appeal of the Mad Max films, shows that he had a keen interest and at the very least a basic familiarity with psychological archetype concepts. The same interviewer, Danny Peary, wrote a follow-up piece in 1988 where he further expanded upon his meeting with Miller. He outlined that when developing Road Warrior, Miller had read Joseph Campbell's psychology book called Hero with a Thousand Faces, and that the archetypes in that book, which included Jungian psychological references, had directly influenced the writing of Road Warrior. Let's get started with one of the major motifs, the presentation of animal instincts in the film's characters. In the opening scenes, after the historical montage, Max is associated with his half-breed dingo dog. The dog appears to match and mirror his emotions during the chase and in the immediate aftermath, even mutually reacting to the villain Wes approaching on a motorbike. It has a red rag around its neck in parallel with Max having a red rag tied around his arm. It's an archetypal shadow version of himself, a stray, a scavenger, just like Max. And when Max is on the verge of being killed here, his dog is killed as a foreshadow of what nearly happens to him. The timing of the dog's death also fits well with the change that occurs in Max shortly after. He decides to try and help the camp occupants by driving the rig. He's decided to rejoin humanity, at least for the time being. So the death of his dog is an appropriate severance from this animalistic, self-interested survival instinct that had dominated him up until this point in the story. With the hilarious character called the Gyro Captain, we have another animal instinct shadow paradigm.
Don't hurt the snake! Put it down!
I've got to feed the snakes.
Lethal, these snakes. Born killers. It's my snake. I trained it. I'm going to eat it.
He seems to identify with the stealthy cunning of snakes. But when Max has him captive, we get a shot of a rabbit fleeing from something, so it's like he is now the scared rabbit. Later on, the anxiety of the camp occupants will be depicted through the anxious fleeing of rabbits, pigs and chickens.
Close the gate! They're coming back! They'll set us loose and then cut us down like pigs!
Wes shoots a rabbit to show that no human can escape.
This is the death.
See? Nothing can escape! The Among Us rules the wasteland!
The perceived parallel between scared people and scared animals is culturally ingrained across the globe. For example, toddlers in their physical vulnerability usually have strong identification with vulnerable-looking small animals, and they don't like seeing those animals get hit. With Max's dog, the human parallel creature is less timid than a rabbit. It has the capacity to be a predator, or at least put up a strong fight, but it's also small enough to be vulnerable. After all, Max is, throughout the film, torn between the opposing fundamental positions of self-interested lone survivor and socially responsible member of civilization. Gyro Captain is similar. Max abandons the camp occupants after delivering the rig, and Gyro Captain almost abandons them, but he doesn't because he's unable to persuade the girl who he wants to leave with him and become a wasteland scavenger partner. Then we have the bad guys, many of whom wear costume adornments that equate them with animals. Wes has an attached tail of some kind and has big black feathers sticking out of his shoulder pads. With his red Mohican, an aggressive colour as if his head is on fire, and him speaking more often in primal screams than actual dialogue, he comes across like a predatory bird, like a vulture or an eagle perhaps. When we do hear him speak, his voice is like an animal hiss.
Oh, we go in. Tony, the gas! Hurry up!
Elsewhere, he just makes animal noises generally. And his buttocks on display always made me think of him as being equivalent to a wild baboon. This is an ex-man who has given himself over to predatory animal instinct. Other gang members have animalistic behaviour and costume elements. They have claws that can scratch their enemies. This guy has an animal hat. Oh, and by the way, in line with these animal metaphors, the Gyro Captain has a particularly large set of gnashes that make him look like an animal of some kind, like maybe a horse or an ape. Then we have the Feral Kid, as he's known in the script, whose costume is clearly animalistic and who only speaks in animal-like noises.
Shoot! Shoot! Go!
And almost certainly the child was picked because of his animal-like face. He represents the future of humanity as being a total regression back to animal instinct, and so the battle over this kid here between Max and Wes, I consider that symbolic of the overall struggle for which way the future of humanity will go. Max wins, and the kid is so inspired by him that when we discover at the end of the film that the narrator is actually this kid, we know that it was Max who psychologically rescued him from his decline into an animal state. There's lots more animal-human hybrid metaphors in the film if you keep an eagle eye out for them, but the basic point is that we humans forever carry with us, unconsciously, the predator-prey animal instincts of our evolutionary ancestors. And that concept is built into the visual design concepts of the movie. From a Jungian perspective, Road Warrior manifests the animal instinct portion of mankind's psychological shadow. To have the characters verbalise the theme, it would have been less powerful, but having it so prominent at the visual metaphor level, this nicely bridges the conscious versus unconscious gap for the audience. We're made thoroughly aware of it at the level of feeling or intuition, but any conscious verbalization of the theme is left for the viewer to decide. In fact, that's the central reason why movies and other art forms can be so powerful. By manifesting unconscious truths in non-verbal but very specific sensory forms, art can bring those truths almost into full awareness, but the viewer then has to take the final step of putting it into words, if they want to and if they're able to. Next up, we have the unconscious identification between human characters and their vehicles. Like with costumes, people tend to choose their vehicles and how they adorn them in accordance with their own personality. And mixed in there is the expression of who they would like to be seen as. George Miller revealed in one interview that every character in the film had a personal backstory written for them, which was used as the basis for their costume and vehicle designs. So every time someone dies in this film, it's the conclusion of their own particular story. That's quite a refreshing approach compared with non-speaking characters in most movies, especially action movies, being wafer thin. I think this is one of my favourite aspects of The Road Warrior. All the characters feel important. They may not speak in dialogue, but they pop up in several scenes, identifiable by the costumes and vehicles. This gives them a continuous life of their own in the narrative. Perhaps the most obvious vehicle expression element is that the villains try to make their vehicles imposing to others, using mostly dark colours. And the Humongous has a big, bulky, metallic-framed machine that matches his muscular physique and metallic mask. One of the gay villains has a pink-dyed beard and a pink-coloured car. And for anyone who is inclined to think that the film is homophobic for having a lot of gay villains, which it does have if you read the script, before you jump on your high horse to complain, Miller explained this aspect of the villains as being motivated by not wanting to cause pregnancies, being that the wasteland life is so hostile and resources so scarce, it would be near impossible to raise a baby. Would it even be worth bringing a baby into this violent setting? I don't think so. Another colour that's common in the villain vehicles is red. The one whose occupant brutally pulls the warrior woman and the mechanic onto the road, this is red. And this very persistent truck, also coloured in red, which is constantly involved in the end chase. Max has a slick, fast car, mostly lacking in expressive adornments, being that he's a loner. I mean, who would he be trying to impress? Its black colour and beat-up, dirty, decaying frame match his costume and unshaven, rugged appearance. How appropriate that he and his car get smashed at the same time, Max almost being killed along with his car. Gyro Captain is one of the most optimistic characters in the film, retaining a sense of humour and a desire to reconnect with other human beings. He even has a flower on his coat, showing that he still appreciates beauty where he can find it. So isn't it appropriate that of all the characters, he's the only one who has a flying vehicle that can take him up above the desert landscape and into the spiritual headspace of the sky? When we get to the near end of the movie and Max has found a new determination to take on the enemy, he gets to drive the all-dominating rig that can smash all comers, even the Humongous. So it's like a representation of his newfound cast-iron resolve. The Animal Instincts theme is also specifically merged into some of the villain vehicles. A cobra ready to spring a lethal strike, a swooping black bat with vampiric teeth. Here's another bat. Here's a bike with a red demon face on the front. And they have assorted animal skulls. Here's Wes, sleeping next to one. And sometimes we have them on the bonnets of the cars. These are all symbols of death to their enemies, but also a reflection of how the villains have been reduced to animal instincts and have lost their own humanity. Some of the vehicles are reduced down to bare metal frames, like skeletons stripped of their flesh, and human captives are worn on the vehicles like trophy animals that have just been hunted, or like hood ornaments. The script also includes a description of this dead guy's belongings, which includes a necklace made of teeth and spark plugs. There's another symbolic fusion between man and machine. Unlike the good guys, many of these villains never show their face. It's like they have become their masks. They have become their steel-framed vehicles, and there's nothing else left beneath these two forms of mask. The merging between men and machines is even true of the good guys. The The mechanic has no use of his actual legs, so he has to be moved about by a machine mechanism, like he's fused with it. And this hilarious extra draws a direct parallel between his own broken teeth and broken components of the rig. He even gestures towards his own teeth as he speaks.
Timing gears.
Got a cracked timing case, Colour. It's broken a couple of teeth off the timing gear.
The radio's damaged the core.
One great metaphor that I didn't pick up on until reading the script is that after the first car chase, one of the villain's cars is dripping gasoline and blood from the dying driver in the same place. Like the dead guy and his smashed car are bleeding in parallel. And you can see these two forms of blood mixed together in the film. Like in life, these characters often rev their engines as a battle cry. And the funny thing about that is that I think there's a subconscious association with the growls and roars of lions and other predatory animals. Did you ever notice that moment in Raiders of the Lost Ark when a lion or tiger roar was dubbed in as an engine sound effect? Here it is. Great that, isn't it? And it's so easy to miss, but it illustrates that the sounds of animal roars are so similar to the sounds of vehicle engines. The same psychological principle, I think, is at work in Road Warrior. In battle scenes, the growls of car engines can be thought of as the raging emotions of the people in conflict. These animal and vehicle identification themes are deeply psychological stuff in Road Warrior. I think it's part of what gives the film great rewatch value. So much is being said without words about all the characters, even the least prominent extras, through their costumes and vehicle designs. It makes the overall scenario feel a lot more real on account of it. In Jungian psychology, we humans have a habit of unconsciously projecting our psychological shadow, the unconscious hidden parts of ourselves, onto external people and then reacting to it. Often this takes the form of hating someone else for perceived traits that the hater deep down knows is actually a part of themselves, but they want to deny its existence. But it's not always about projecting things we dislike about ourselves. Sometimes we project our non-verbal beliefs about who we are, such as through our choice of animal pets and our choices of vehicle. We choose these things in accordance with our perception of ourselves, as is so clearly the case in Road Warrior. In terms of the Jungian concept of projecting our darker, repressed sides onto others and then viewing those people as an enemy to be vilified and attacked, Road Warrior certainly depicts this concept. George Miller explained in his 1984 interview for Danny Peary that Max and Wes were deliberately designed to be versions of each other and that he viewed Papagallo and Humungus in the same way. Note that Papagallo's bulky metallic vehicle in the end chase bears similarity to the Humungus's vehicle. And so it seems appropriate, doesn't it, that the Humungus kills Papagallo, his own conceptual twin. Similar is going on with Max and Wes. They are cast as mirrored opponents in the very beginning, doing battle with each other throughout the film, and ending in this direct confrontation and Wes's death. The way I view it is that Max himself has several shadow manifestations in the film, just as it's been said that everybody who appears in our dreams is a part of ourselves. There's Wes, of course. Miller explained that in parallel, Max and Wes each get used as pawns by their respective leaders, Wes being chained here, and Max not being told that the tanker he is driving has no gas in it. Miller also cited another parallel that I'd never noticed, the Humungus and Papagallo each explaining the same concept to their underling, that they are not the only one who has suffered.
I understand your pain. We all lost someone below.
Do you think you're the only one that's suffered? We've all been through it in here.
Brilliant. But also think of Papagallo and Gyro Captain as mirrored versions of Max as well. They represent the humanity that he is desperately trying to suppress in himself. Max rejects all possibilities of emotional reconnection with other human beings. The camp occupants are decent, trustworthy people, but Max is too afraid of embracing them and suffering the heartbreak if they die, like his wife and baby did. He has an opportunity for a new child and a new girlfriend in a new community, And in the Gyro Captain, Max has the opportunity of a new best friend to replace the one he lost in the first film, but he totally rejects all these offers. Gyro Captain, however, seizes these opportunities. He is the version of Max who came back in from the cold. In a less comical form, Papagallo is the leader that Max could have been. Max had the brains and the charisma, but not the courage. To that effect, I consider Papagallo to be the true hero of the story. He is the one who has led and inspired the community through a terrifying war. He's the man with the plans. This sand-pouring egg-timer moment probably indicating that it was his idea to replace the gasoline in the tanker with sand, utterly fooling his opponents. Even when he's just been shot with an arrow, he continues assessing the situation and giving instructions.
I'm okay, just get them organised. We're moving out tonight. How's the rig?
24 hours.
24 hours?
They've got 12.
Okay, so who's gonna drive the tanker?
I am.
In my view, Papagallo is one of the most underappreciated screen heroes in movie history, overshadowed by Max, of course, but if you pay attention to him, he shines as the hero that Max could have been. Being a hero isn't just about killing villains, it's about leading people psychologically and spiritually. So, all the repressed aspects of Max, both his goodness and the evil that he also refuses to give himself over to, these repressed traits manifest in at least 4 forms: the Humongous, Wes, Papagallo, and the Gyro Captain. It's very sophisticated characterization, and it's done with minimalist dialogue from Max. From what I've heard, he's only got 17 lines in the film, and yet so much is said about who he is through these character comparisons. The death of Wes and Humongous signifies the ending of the entire conflict, like the shadow has been overcome, or at least has been repressed back into the unconscious box. There could be a mirrored relationship as well between the Gyro Captain and this amusing character called the Toady. Both are comical in appearance and behaviour. I'm not sure about that one. But I also think overall that the entire set of mostly black-clothed villains serve as the dark side of the white-clothed good guys in the camp. Throughout the whole movie, the good guys are fighting against the possibility of collectively slipping back into a medieval or animal instinct state. And appropriate to the Jungian concept of the shadow, when the villains are seen at their absolute worst when they're torturing their captives, they are literally seen as silhouettes, like shadows. This overall metaphor within the film, in turn, is letting the audience know that we too have a brutal, savage, dark side that is merely waiting for the right desperate survival circumstances before it can be unleashed. Most of us have never really been in a situation of having to become violent just to be able to survive from one day to the next, and I don't just mean defending against savage enemies. The need for basic resources such as food, water, shelter or medical supplies can very quickly escalate any of us toward competitive violence if those resources are scarce enough. In this film, gasoline is the placeholder symbol of scarce resources to be fought over, and it was chosen for the narrative because the director had witnessed people's fast decline into violence at petrol stations during the oil supply crisis of the 1970s. The director had also witnessed the brutal aftermaths of car crashes at a hospital he'd worked at, citing that in the absence of guns, a lot of Australians had substituted their vehicles as weapons and had been driving like maniacs on the country's vast network of long and mostly unpoliced roads. Both of those real-world inspirations for the first 2 Mad Max films are clear examples of how the dark, violent shadow of humans can manifest in response to either sudden resource scarcity or the mere absence of civil law and order. Fitting with the latter, we find in Road Warrior that Max is an ex-cop caught between the 2 hemispheres of civility and chaos. But several of the Humongous' gang are ex-cops who have completely swapped sides and become outlaw criminals. They even have police lights glowing on their vehicles in several scenes, as if to emphasise this metaphor. Miller talked about the villains in this manner, stating that a lot of the villains may have even been co-workers or neighbours of the good guys before the collapse of society. At one point it was even planned that the Humongous character would actually be the Goose character from the first film, Max's cop buddy who was severely burned and hospitalised. This would make the character even more a mirror of Max. Overall, I think the film is saying to us, these villains are what you might become given the necessary circumstances, so keep a careful watch on your own Jungian shadow. Control it, or it might one day control you. Okay, so before we move to the final section of this study, a lot of the concepts and observations in this video are drawn from my 2-hour study of Road Warrior, which I made about a decade ago and is still available on my site as a digital download. I have included quite a few extra details and dynamics in this video that you're watching, some of it's stuff I'd not noticed before, but there's loads of extra concepts and details in my old video that are not about Jungian psychology, so I didn't include them here. So go get a copy of that video if you're interested. The link to my downloads page is in the video description. With that said, let's move on. Now for a Jungian psychology styled interpretation of the film's ending. This is something I only picked up on in the last year or so I don't think I touched on it at all in my previous studies of the film. It's a pattern that I've recently noticed in multiple hero story variations, such as the ending of John Wayne's The Searchers, Rambo, The Seven Samurai, The Magnificent Seven, The Thing, The Warriors, The Dollars Trilogy, The Dirty Dozen, and High Plains Drifter. There are loads more examples that I'm sure you'll be able to think of. The concept is that while our dark, violent and ruthless shadow generally should be repressed or at least controlled and carefully watched, like keeping a dangerous guard dog on a chain, there can be circumstances in life where that very destructive shadow can come to our aid. If someone is physically trying to kill you, then unleashing your hidden capacity for violence can save your life, and that's a very useful thing. Nature gave us these violent instincts with a primarily positive survival purpose, but it didn't do a good job of ensuring that we only release those urges in the right circumstances. Civilization and all the abundant resources it brings has mostly eliminated our need to be violent at all. Many of us can live near enough an entire lifetime without ever having to become truly violent. But we can't count on society to always provide these protections, nor can we trust our own leaders not to become violent tyrants themselves. When their activities go unchecked, they virtually always do. So our dark, violent survival instinct side has to be kept in reserve in case it's ever needed, just like a country will have military forces on reserve even when it's not actually at war. But if we do ever need to unleash that part of ourselves, as soldiers do in the battlefield, we also need to be able to put our violent shadow back into the unconscious box when the war is over, so that we don't start harming other people who aren't actually our enemies. This deep psychological dilemma in the human condition manifests in many action movies. The hero represents the hidden, violent, survivalist side of ourselves. The hero, or sometimes a group of heroes, shows up from some unknown origin out there in the wilderness, which represents our own subconscious, where violent instincts are normally repressed. The hero materializes in a narrative situation where peaceful, civilized people are being threatened by some brutal external enemies. And he seems to conveniently show up only at this time when he is in need. The hero engages in the ruthless but controlled violence necessary to defeat the enemies. He's able to do this because he is similar to the enemy himself, but he's less out of control. After the enemies have been defeated and the hero's job is done, he no longer has a social function. His violence is no longer needed. In fact, without an enemy to fight, the hero is potentially very dangerous. And so this hero, who represents the unleashed, violent shadow of the good guys who otherwise were unable to effectively fight back, he then disappears back into the unconscious wilderness at the end of the story. One of the best examples of this is The Magnificent Seven, itself a remake of The Seven Samurai. A village of peaceful farmers are having their food taken by bandit scavengers who kill anyone who objects. A group of 7 gunfighters, or drifters, a term that has ghosts of the unconscious connotations, are reluctantly hired for low pay to defend the village. They defeat the enemies, but 4 of them are killed in the battle, appropriate being that they are no longer needed. 3 are left alive, and one of them, the youngest one, gives up the gunfighter life and settles on the farm. He's basically another version of the feral kid in Road Warrior. The last 2 gunfighters drift back into the wilderness with a short explanation that fits incredibly well with Max's inability to rejoin humanity.
The old man was right. Only the farmers won. We lost. We always lose.
By the way, if you haven't seen The Magnificent Seven, the original 1960s version, not the crappy spin-offs or the terrible recent remake, I think it was from 2018, I highly recommend it. It's the best Western ever made in my view, and it catapulted multiple actors to stardom, such as Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen. And speaking of Charles Bronson, another movie of his which follows the same "the hero must leave" ending formula is The Dirty Dozen, another amazing film. In that movie, an extremely dangerous mission to kill off a hotel full of Nazi officers involves a group of military prison inmate criminals being sent on the mission. They represent the darker, violent side of Allied forces humanity being unleashed upon the enemy. All but one of them dies in combat because their criminality after the mission is no longer needed psychologically. The Dirty Dozen is loaded with Jungian shadow psychology, so check that one out too. And this is what I see going on in Road Warrior. Max is the reluctant hero, the suppressed subconscious warrior who the good guys need to help them. He materializes into their world, even strangely appearing to swoop down onto the road in the intro after a montage talking about ghosts and demons of the past. And funnily enough, this is kind of how the Gyro Captain is introduced to the camp occupants as well. Max helps the good guys defeat the Humongous' gang, and once it's all done, he chooses not to go with them because, at the Jungian shadow psychological level, the good guys no longer need that part of themselves. Max is the part of them that they needed to unleash to win the war and move on to greener pastures. And so now, Max must be psychologically repressed. He must fade into the wilderness of the unconscious, the internal no man's land from which he hopefully won't need to be called upon again. But the feral kid never forgets him because he knows that our dark shadow is something that should never be completely abandoned. Max is that fighting spirit part of ourselves that we need to always maintain a distant memory of in case we ever need to call it forth again. That's why we hold great reverence for the outsider hero culturally and personally. That's why the positive aspects of the shadow get personified in allegorical stories, because we instinctively know that the battle for survival and civility is never over. We know that one day, either we or our offspring or future generations will need to utilize our dark, violent shadow again to ensure our very survival. Okay, we're about done. If you want to know more about Jungian psychology, then check out my recent review of Carl Jung's excellent book, The Undiscovered Self. If you want to know more about Road Warrior, then check out the 2-hour analysis, which is available on my site. And now, it's time for me to fade off into the wilderness too.